Hey, Cody.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. It works.
Hola.
Hola, hola.
I even got an Apple Pencil so it doesn't look like my big arm is coming across when I need to mute from my iPad that's out in front of me. Good morning. So, hey, Ricky, so
organizations are collecting a lot of new and different information than maybe what they had been processing in the past. And, as with new information, we've got new information security issues that arise with that. I think we're also going to touch on some physical security topics today with that, but I think that's more or less the stage. So we've got new technologies being required, sometimes being required by government, sometimes it's organizations that are choosing to do this on their own, and then all the risks that are associated with that.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Cody. So maybe moving over to Mike, given your position with education, and that's kind of a hot topic lately with, back to school and how different organizations are approaching that. What are you seeing from your end, and how is that being impacted with everything with COVID?
Well, it's been quite the adventure. I mean, it's a great question, Ricky, and I think Cody set the stage for us perfectly. There's what we can do, there's what we should do, and then there's also what's legal to do, and we have to rationalize all three of those with a new lens, because now sometimes life and safety can be at stake. So I found myself saying yes to some things this year that last year I'd have been like, no, I don't think that's a very good risk. Now it's like, okay, the trade-off is life safety versus, okay, maybe we have to bolt on some additional controls or talk to some additional experts. Now, of course, what I'm going to talk about is not necessarily representative of what we're doing at Grand Canyon. It's going to be more representative of the discussion, and I'm not able to talk about the details. But the possibility of what we can track and the potential that it opens up from a life safety and contact tracing perspective is pretty incredible, right? When you're on Wi-Fi on a large corporate campus or a large university campus, you all of a sudden know who is where. If you have a NAC in place, you have an identity linked to a location and the movement of that. If you have badge readers and doors, check in, check out, now all of a sudden you have movement, you have location, you can correlate. And then if you layer that data in with things like schedules, where people are supposed to be, whether it's cubicle assignments, physical locations. And then nowadays there's even a lot of ubiquitous use of things like facial recognition, machine learning to recognize license plates. All of a sudden, we've always known it's possible, but there's never been a use case where we would scratch our heads and contemplate, like, is this a good thing to do? Our answer a year ago would have been, of course not, it's not a good thing to do. We need to, privacy is number one. And now it comes down to, well, okay, if we have to tell 5 people to isolate because we know specifically who was where versus 500 people to isolate because we really don't know, we're just sort of guessing. Or if we have the ability to properly contain something dangerous, it's a new conversation, right?
Yeah, exactly. And maybe over to you, Mark. What are you seeing from the consulting side of things?
Yeah, it's a new paradigm, and as Mike and Cody have launched this discussion very well, the data points are increasing dramatically. So the amount of data that's being collected is increasing. The types of devices that we need to support now are new. It's not just a camera, right? It's not just observation of an area. It's, well, how many people are in those areas and who are they? And, I think about it from just a privacy, a consent. Obviously, people don't think about, leveraging their badge to get into a building to go to work. Well, now it's, how do you feel? Have you been around anybody that potentially has been sick? And, you obviously don't want to put at risk yourself or anybody, you know, in your office. And so, you know, when you think about the amount of data points increasing, the amount of observations that are increasing from a data perspective, who is in the building, how long are they in the building, what's the capacity percentage that is allowed on a company basis. And, you know, a lot of companies are allowing 30% capacity back into their buildings. And for our particular organization, we have to register if we want to go into the office and work. And we're following a pretty flexible policy and a very supportive policy of what works for you as an individual. So if you choose to go in the office, you absolutely can, but you have to pre-register. And so you have to make sure that you can plan ahead. You have to register to go into that office and work out of the office for the day. But if there's already 30% capacity reservations in that office, you're obviously not going into the office and you get to work from home. So, you know, it's a combination of, you know, it's an extension of there's no expectation of privacy, right? When you're in a work environment. I think it's kind of the extension of, you know, there really is no expectation of privacy. You're not only showing up with a badge, you're showing up with your temperature, right? You're showing up with how am I feeling? Do I continue to feel, you know, normal throughout the day? And taking on some personal accountability of, you know, hey, I'm not feeling as good as I was when I first came. I'm going to go ahead and, you know, not just leave the premises and maybe go work from home, but now I have to notify someone, right? That, you know, maybe I wasn't feeling great and maybe I need to go get some additional testing done, right? And then you have those additional data points of, well, who's been tested, who hasn't been tested. And then you have the notifications of, you know, who has been confirmed, you know, to have COVID, who's been tested and negative, who's been having, you know, asymptomatic situations. There's all the HR and privacy concerns around that as well. So this is definitely a very intermixed topic, right, across physical security, logical security, privacy monitoring, and, you know, the data security elements of where's this data kept and how long do we keep it. So this is, yeah, very exciting conversation.
So
Yeah,
we have our first question or comment in the area from T-Mako. In terms of what Mike was saying too, it's one thing if a computer knows the location and contact details, and another if people do, even in a limited set. So what are some protections that are being put in to anonymize the people and only unmask when it is a real need? And what types of policies are in place to inform that only subjective individuals versus overhead, you know, IT and healthcare and state? So maybe Mike, you want to start with that one?
Sure, yeah. One, T-Mako, great question. You know, I think tokenization is really key because you're right. It's a big difference for that data to be anonymously tracked, perhaps even vaulted and accessed only if you do have an outbreak or only if it becomes life safety, versus whatever entity you're working for or going to school at all of a sudden becoming a big brother, right? Or having misuse of that data by people who have conflicting interests with that data. So great question. I think tokenization is really the key there. If we're logging these things to random values, correlating them together with a unique identifier, and then there's a very well protected way to cache in that token and be able to tie those tokens to real identities and people only in an emergency, I feel like that would make a world of difference. But I'm sure Cody and Mark have something to add on this too.
Yeah, so I mean, what we're getting at here is pretty much a core sort of privacy concept. And so when we're talking about privacy and personal information and what you can and can't do with data, we have to determine whether or not it is personal information or personal data, depending on the jurisdiction. And the privacy law over the last several years has shifted to expand the scope of what's considered personal data by quite a bit. So now it's not just, you know, the things that you may traditionally think about, like social security number and a driver's license number and bank account number and that kind of stuff. Now it's anything that can reasonably be used to identify an individual. And so when you've got information, for example, on location. There's only one person that can be in a specific point at a specific place at a specific point in time, right? And so if you've got information regarding somebody, a person is moving, within this vicinity, and there's nobody else that could be there, even though you don't have that person's name attached to it, right? You can still say that that's probably personal data because there's only one person that could be there. And you couple that with something else, and you certainly could identify who that person is. And when we're talking about tokenization and trying to use that for some of these data gathering things, we also have to remember that why we're gathering the data. And a lot of times it's because we're trying to do contact tracing or things like that. And the whole point of doing contact tracing is so that we can reach out to specific individuals, right? To let them know that you specifically have been exposed to this or something like that. And so the general advice that I say that we probably usually give when it comes to these kinds of things is, number one, don't collect data if you don't need the data, if you don't have a really good reason to have it. And then second, don't keep it for any longer than you need it. Tokenization and anonymization and pseudonymization, which is a new word that some of us have learned in the last couple of years. These are techniques that sound good, but they're very difficult to do in a lot of cases because so many times you can reconstitute whatever the original data was based on other factors that you might also be in possession of. And so it's not really anonymizing it if you can do that. And so, I think it's not a panacea to say tokenization is going to solve our ills on this, but it is a technique that, if implemented properly, is definitely a way that we can get there. But I there's a lot more that I'm sure we're going to talk about on this topic throughout the course of the next hour or so. But I kind of want to set the stage that there's we've got competing interests. We've got, on the one hand, the privacy concerns, but on the other hand, we do have a need to use the data for something. And if we've anonymized it to the point where it's useless, then why are we keeping it?
Yeah.
Right. And
Sure.
well, I should let whoever finish that thought. Go ahead, follow up. I have another question.
Yeah, so let me just add on a few comments. So Cody brings up a great point, because personal information, the evolution of personal information and the definition of PII has expanded, right? So is my address personal information? Well, not in and of itself, as long as it's not in combination, right, with other things about me. But when you add location information, you add proximity to me as a person, right, based on some data point, right? I think the privacy elements of policies and procedures need to be looked at from an organizational standpoint, but also we need to look at data classification as well, of what's being collected and how is it classified, right? And how are we going to maintain it, control it, distribute it, share it, or not, either inside an organization or outside an organization. And so there's a lot of not only just identity components and concerns about location and where people are at and for how long, and is there any type of contact tracing notifications required. But it goes back into an organization's identity management programs. It goes back into an organization's policies and procedures. It goes back into the definition of what is sensitive and private information, and it just extends the data elements around that. So there's going to be some policies and procedures that need to be looked at. There's going to be some protocols around data management. There's going to be, obviously, and Cody and Mike have said this, is if you don't need it, don't capture it. If you only need it for a period of time, capture it for only that period of time, or anonymize it or do something to it. So you can look at trends and or volume, data analysis versus individual data analysis, unless there's a specific use case for it. But the longer all of those data points are kept and the more specific they are, that's where people are going to have, permission concerns or consent concerns, or, what are you actually doing with this information?
Yeah, I was just going to add to the points that everybody made is that also, if you look at it, at what point do you draw the line as far as when does it become a data point and when does it become PII, right? That correlation between all those data points, if they're all stored in separate systems, then you have some kind of, you know, separation. But if they're merged at any point, then you've got a whole set of data points that tie together to a specific individual.
Right, and I think, T also had an additional question that kind of goes into this, and probably most relevant to Mike with the type of audience that he has, users that he has. So, you know, in some cases, it appears that the data science statistics are really ill-considered to drive the policies at this point. And specifically, are the universities or other large institutions going to go into mandatory or truly random statistically relevant sampling? We use this outside of COVID-19 via polling. Why not for COVID? Is, you know, there's been instances of, hey, we're going to check the water in this particular area and see how widespread COVID is. Mike, do you have any follow-up for that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an awesome idea, and I think it's happening some, right? I mean, we can use power and sample size, especially over a time series, to make predictions. We can use regression and other tools to to predict where things are going, and whether that's looking at temperature checks, or I read a study last month about a university taking samples of viral load and reclaimed water. You know, there's all sorts of things we can do to, of course, take in data points, apply statistical models, and predict trends. Unfortunately, I do agree with the statement, though. Sometimes we seem to have a breakdown just at a global scale right now. Well, I'll say a national scale, with taking scientific data and using that to, in a consistent, unified way, have policies that drive consistent decisions and adherence to those policies. Like that seems to be something we struggle with on a large scale right now. And of course, cities, towns, governments, universities, companies, we're just a microcosm of that larger problem. But yeah, great point.
So going back to, you know, collecting that data, and especially with exposure notifications, there has been a lot of discourse about the Android and Apple both having a tracing or a contact program that you have to turn on. And James also brought up that iOS 13.7 provides an update, again, that allows the end user to opt into the COVID-19 exposure notifications. And, you know, he says, I am hesitant to opt into this type of solution given the potential for misuse. What assurances should we look for to ensure that this type of tracking is used for the citizens' best interest? And do we realistically have any control over these types of COVID tracking measures?
Cody, do you want to start with that one? That sounds like
Sure, yeah, I figured this was coming to me. So what you're relying on in many ways is the contractual obligations, because Apple and Google have set up, you know, contractual limitations with what the data can be used for. It reminds me of a story here. I've been working on a lot of these projects, and I had a client that had developed these tracking procedures for visitors and employees onto different sites. And some people in some groups were like, hey, you know, obviously we're collecting it to track coronavirus infections and that kind of thing, and to maintain health screenings. But now that they've collected this data, other groups were like, well, now we can use that to figure out, you know, the efficiency of travel between offices. And we can use that to figure out if people are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing when they're on the clock, and what they're doing, how long it took them to transit from one place to another. And so there's all this other analysis that you can perform once you've collected this data. And from a privacy perspective, when you are going to collect personal information, by law in almost everywhere, you're only allowed to do with it what you have told the person that you're collecting it from what you're going to do. And so if you haven't told them up front that you intend to do all that analysis and all that stuff, then now you're violating privacy law potentially. And so, you know, but the fact that the data exists, and this is really what I'm getting at, it's so tempting now to try to do all these other things with the data. And so to answer the question whether or not you should opt in, it's a choice for yourself to make. But, you know, as with anything, once the data has been collected and it's sitting there and you don't have, you know, confirmation that it's deleted when it's supposed to be, when whatever the decision was or whatever it was primarily supposed to be used for has been completed, there's always the potential for additional uses that you didn't know about.
Yeah, well said.
And
I think,
kind
I think you have to look at the use cases of the contact tracing apps. I understand the intent of them. I understand that, you know, you're supposed to obviously allow the app to know where you're at. You're supposed to allow the app to basically register yourself. And then if you are considered positive, right, from a COVID perspective, then the apps typically share that information with anybody that you've been around on an automated basis. So you really have to look at not only application permissions, but the use cases that the app's going to share data about you and under what conditions. And obviously it's for a positive intent, right? From a notification and an educational and informing perspective. But you also have to look at, maybe you don't want it to automatically notify everybody you've been around. Maybe they, you know, you want to authorize that and, you know, have a step of authorization in the mix. So you have to look at how the apps are built, what they're intended to do, and you know, what's being automatically shared versus maybe requires some authorization.
Yeah, I think those are some great points. And I think also the one thing you have to consider is, you know, most people, you know, probably our community would be the exception, don't really take the time to read those end user license agreements and go through all that and pay attention to those details, where a lot of the population just kind of hits next and hits okay and install, right? So a lot of times people may not even be aware of what they're authorizing these vendors to have access to. And, you know, that'll bite them in the end, but they may be just looking for the initial, you know, notification or information and see that, you know, quick benefit, but not think of it long term as far as what data are they actually giving away.
Yeah, and the other item that we have to think about here is what about modification of data within the apps that's not accurate, right? What if somebody is being what if an application's notifying you as being COVID positive when you're not? Kind of like the, you know, fake news situation, but it's fake health information, you know, for either a nuisance situation or malicious situation, or you know, somebody's targeting somebody else and wants to cause some problems. So you have to think about the, you know, the data integrity issues as well.
Yeah, I think it might be a good time to talk about the different types of data and different technologies that are being used and deployed right now to collect all this, because not everybody may realize all the different things that are being used for screening and contact tracing and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, a lot of you have probably experienced, you know, I know that Mark mentioned this registration process where before you can even get into a facility, you may have to register ahead of time, filling out a questionnaire, for example, to answer yes or no. Have you been in contact with somebody that's had coronavirus? Have you been outside of the country into a, you know, a hotspot? You know, those kind of things. And a lot of us are probably familiar with those questionnaires. And then we've seen some of the temperature screenings. So, you know, there's different ways that you can collect somebody's temperature. There's a thermometer that you can stick in somebody's mouth. That's probably not going to happen at most places now. Most people are probably using the trigger gun, laser infrared thing to determine somebody's surface temperature. But I've also had a lot of companies that are using thermal imaging, using infrared cameras, where somebody would stand in front of it. It'll detect a hot spot and tell your temperature based on surface characteristics from infrared spectrum. And then on top of all of that, there are also companies that are providing temperature monitoring devices that can be worn or carried with a person that will connect, for example, through your cell phone or something like that. So there's a lot of different ways that temperature can be collected and analyzed, and each one of those produces actually somewhat different data. And so it's not just temperature per se. So in the thermal imaging instance, yes, you do have information regarding somebody's temperature, but you also have an image of their at least their face, probably, even though it's an infrared image, and in some cases their entire body. And so in a situation like that, you've got infrared, which can see through different materials, so you can actually pick up other characteristics of a person's biometric makeup based on just your intent to collect temperature. So these are the kinds of things just on the temperature aspect that I think are important to recognize, and maybe we can talk about here in a little bit. I'll just run through a couple of the other technologies that I've seen. So there's proximity sensors that I've seen deployed. Sometimes they use cell phones. Sometimes there are things that are wearable on people's wrists or some other part of their body that'll detect either where they are, which would give precise geolocation, or it's more like a proximity alarm. If you get within 6 feet of somebody else wearing one, or within another one of these devices, it'll alarm and track those interactions and those sorts of things. I know Mike already mentioned facial recognition. That's certainly used a lot in combination with a lot of these things to try to verify where people are on premises using existing surveillance technology. And then video surveillance obviously is something that's already been deployed and in use, but now it's being used for yet another new purpose, and that's to track where people are for coronavirus spread. And then there's also social media scanning. There are some companies that are monitoring people's social media feeds to see if they're in fact following protocols or posting images of themselves, not wearing a mask or going out to a party or going to a restaurant, that kind of stuff. So that's additional data gathering that some companies are doing that you may not realize is happening. And then, of course, there's all the different contact tracing apps that we've already talked about. So, this is just a sampling of the kinds of things that are out there that I think it would just be helpful to sort of keep in mind that this is a broader issue than just a few different things.
So Cody, are there certain industries right now that are going, where I would consider a little bit further in terms of the infrared and the doing the individual devices to people? Is it certain types of industries that are doing this, or where do you think that this is being found?
Yeah, I think education is definitely one place that we're seeing a lot of this kind of stuff being deployed, because or any and really any other industry where you're going to have, by the nature of the industry, a lot of people probably in close proximity to each other. So you can think of like big manufacturing facilities where people have to be on a manufacturing floor together, or things like that. In industries where people can work from home, or things like that, you're probably not going to, it doesn't matter. Who cares how close I am to anybody? I'm not close to anybody when I'm working at home. But, it's usually those kinds of industries where some contact is probably unavoidable. At least that's what I'm seeing. I'm sure there's more, I only see what I see, but that's probably what I would say. I'd say in the manufacturing space too, or anybody else that's got controlled access to facilities where you might have a lot of people going in and out. That's when you may have more of these automated sorts of solutions. If you've got thousands of people that are needing to go in and out of a facility a day, it's going to be harder for you to implement like a manual temperature screening process, right? So that would be a situation where these more automated thermal imaging technologies might be deployed, because they're not cheap, right, to do this. And so you do get some economies of scale when you've got a lot of people moving in and out. And so that's generally what I would see.
Yeah, kind of to your point, Cody, the flip side of that, what I've seen with our company, they've actually, as of March, when they sent pretty much everybody who was able to work from home, they actually, as of a couple months ago, removed all access to the physical locations for us. So if you need to get something from your office, you need to, VP approval, you need to go through lots of hoops to gain access to a physical location and coordinate it with security and all that. So, we're seeing kind of the two spectrums.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, in it.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was
Go
just
ahead,
going
Mike.
to add on that. Yeah, all great comments. And I mean, on one hand, on the Apple side too, with the Apple app, you could argue that Apple has a lot of that data anyway, or Android if we carry one of those. And we consented to that a long time ago. We researched that. But a lot of these things are bolt-ons. So we've got to wonder, okay, if I have a certain trust level of Apple, what's the organization or services or APIs that this data is being passed to for some of this analysis? Is Apple doing it natively, or is it going somewhere else that I would consider of a different trust level? And, Ricky, I love what you brought up, because, being able to do things where it requires registration, or it prevents the problem from ever happening and from ever having to collect data, well, it certainly reduces some organizational risk if you can do that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's mainly the driver of why they adopted that, right? For our organization, only the essential, whoever's deemed as essential, right, is allowed into buildings, and it's really more around the distribution side of things versus the actual operations of the business. So it's a very fine line that they're making with regards to who gets access and what's deemed essential.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, a lot of fun topics here. I mean, the one thing I'm left with too, though, is on a lot of these things where I would say, hey, no, we want to err on the side of caution with this. There's a much higher stake to these decisions, because if we don't do this, if we do collect the data, we may be bringing ourselves, as organizations, in scope of different regulations. It may make things like a right to forget more complicated. There's all these dynamics. There's proper vaulting. But the flip side is, unlike a lot of other things where it's telling marketing no to something that may generate some revenue, now all of a sudden the stakes of whatever decision we make are higher than they ever were in the past.
I think this is a great example of when privacy and security are at odds with each other. That a lot of people conflate privacy and security as being always in tandem, always in line with each other. And right now, the security issue of protecting life is different. It's opposed to the privacy issue of not collecting and storing data on people that you don't need. And so there is a trade-off that you'll have to make. And, there are a lot of companies that are openly, more or less, saying, you know what, we'll violate privacy law. And we'll take whatever comes with that. And then there are plenty of other organizations that are saying, no, we need to be compliant. And we've got to, do everything within the bounds of the law. This is a situation where there's no like perfect answer on this. But this, to me, is again one of those occurrences where now we've got an opening to start collecting a lot more data than we had before. And once you've started collecting data, you know, who's going to want to stop? So, you know, these companies now, they're going to say, oh, we've got rich data on what people are doing and where they're at and this kind of stuff. So what else can we do with it? And now all of a sudden you've got all kinds of new business processes and analysis that have been built around this data that was supposed to have only been collected for a short amount of time for a specific purpose. But I mean, who knows how long this pandemic is going to go on? I mean, this could be another year or two where we've still got to have these processes in place. So now you've got a couple of years worth of data. That's going to be pretty rich for a lot of other purposes. And that's when the privacy concerns are going to be amplified as more and more technologies and analysis is done on this data.
Yeah, and kind of to Mike's point previously, that who's manipulating the data, right? If Apple or Google are collecting it, but then they're using a third party to do some analysis or generate some information based off that, what happens with that copy of the data, and you know, what's the privacy around that, and who do they kind of ultimately report to? And to your point, Cody, like, this could go on for a couple more years potentially. When do we draw the line as to how far back the data is supposed to go?
Yeah, so I'll give you another sort of anecdote. So at the onset of this pandemic, you know, it started in China, right? And then it spread to Europe and then over here, basically. In China, the privacy laws are fairly weak. And so companies could conduct fairly extensive contact tracing and extensive screening before people could come in. They were taking temperatures, holding those temperature records, all that kind of stuff. Then once it spread to Europe, I remember when Italy was the primary center of the outbreak and everybody was freaking out there. Some people were trying to take the global organizations were trying to take policies that they developed in China and use them in Italy. Well, that's illegal in Italy, because under the GDPR regime, the collecting of temperature data can only be done by trained medical professionals, and there's all kinds of other privacy issues in place. So the Italian Data Protection Office that weekend issued a statement that said, no, you cannot collect temperature data for people coming in. You're not authorized to do that under the privacy law. Anybody that's doing that is breaking the law. Well, GDPR violations, as some of you know, those can be fairly extensive. You could be looking at up to 4% of annual revenue as a penalty for doing something like that. So again, we've got this privacy versus security sort of issue that's at play. But and in a place like Europe, you're looking at very severe penalties that are potential. You know, if you're flaunting these rules, so the risk is real. It's not just a well, you know, what happens if I'm really collecting data? I mean, you're looking at some major stuff, and you know, criminal liability exists in parts of the world too on this. So it's not something to scoff at. But you know, there are companies, like I said, that are consciously making some of these trade-offs, and we'll see how it shakes out. But to your point of, you know, how long should we collect the data? How long should we keep it? And any of that, you know, the general advice that I always give is only keep it as long as you need it. So if you're collecting data to make a decision whether or not somebody should have access to the facility, once you've made the determination, yes, they can access the facility, what do you need that data for after that point? You're not going to make another decision they can access it. The next time they try to access, you're probably going to ask them the questions again. You're probably going to take their temperature again. So all that data that you had the last time they accessed it is irrelevant to this new point in time. So, you know, the general advice is get rid of it the second you don't need it anymore. Because if you don't have the data, you can't do anything with it, and therefore you're probably not going to be able to get in any trouble for it. So there you go.
Yeah, definitely. And I think some of those companies gambling, because I mean, I think the majority of companies are just trying to do the right thing, and there's that natural balance, but there's usually a legal, compliant, and secure way to do things. And I think most companies are trying to do right by both standards that are occasionally at odds. But I'm sure we're out of this. We're going to have our next Cambridge Analytica type thing where there's a massive trove of data that becomes a big boondoggle because some company somewhere cut corners and had a tremendous amount of concerning data. Like, it'll happen somewhere. We just don't know who or where yet.
Right.
And the interesting thing is, as Cody mentioned and Mike reinforced, you know, the privacy and security topics have been complementary for the most part. A few areas there's been a little tension of privacy and security. Now there are some opposing situations, right? Privacy versus security, and ultimately any decision is going to be focused on, you know, preserving life and trying to continue life, right? Over and above, you know, what data has been collected and where it was shared, et cetera. So all the traditional, you know, kind of the data security processes, procedures, focuses, limitations, et cetera. I'm fully confident those will work themselves out. But, you know, and the right answer is yes, we need to do whatever we can to sustain life, preserve life, and continue. And while we work out, you know, basically the kind of the data side of this, which is really just new data elements in the ecosystem of the devices we support, the environments that we're monitoring, and, you know, the combination of risk factors has changed to include health, and, you know, potential impact of others, which you know, beyond typical, you know, cold, flu, and other things. So it's very interesting kind of merging of privacy and security tension in a good way, but you know, for the right reasons. We're doing what we need to from a life safety perspective, and we'll work out the data security things. And I'm sure, as Mike mentioned, there'll be some snafus here and there as far as data collection or data sharing where it's not supposed to be shared, or maybe even you know, a large data exposure situation that was not intended.
So I would just add that having participated in some risky behavior myself, as in, you know, getting a haircut and getting a massage when my pinched nerve was just more painful than I could stand anymore, that to me, I think one of the big vectors is going to be the small businesses that are capturing that information as they are trying to be compliant to state regulations. So gyms and salons and all that have to ask all the questions. They have to provide proof that they're asking those questions, whether or not they have temperature. And I think in some cases, I think some of the things that the states are requiring may be verging into HIPAA and the records that you're keeping too, I'm sure. And I think that's part of what we are going to be having to look at too, especially in a small business, and when we're not talking about huge people who are used to information security as a matter of course. So with that thought, and something to keep the conversation going when we come back from break, we're going to take a 10-minute break right now to allow everybody to, you know, use the restroom, get a cup of tea or coffee, and continue on. We will have some chapter business, we'll have a sponsor talk, and then we will continue our conversation when we come back at 2 o'clock. So thanks everybody, and we'll see you in just a little while. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Cody does have a sexy mic. We're like, are you in a recording studio? Like, are we gonna have fun? and yes, rock star hair, big hair.
Hey, you made it to the salon. We don't have those open here. As you can tell, so.
True. So we just wanted to do a little bit of chapter business right now. So again, a reminder, thanks everybody for joining us on this very first foray into the virtual meeting. Of course, we're going to go back to our regular meetings once, you know, we can have more than 50 people in the same spot. So we're really looking forward to that. Again, raise your hand or chat a question. I am looking at those and making sure to break in so that the panelists can keep going and it can be a little bit more interactive. in order to get the CPE credits for this, we are going to be sending out a survey to the people who registered for this, and just filling out the survey is how we're going to take our attendance. So please make sure that you do return that survey for us. That would be very much helpful. We are planning on doing another one in about 3 weeks. So watch for an invite and details for our next meeting, whether or not it's going to be a single presentation, two presentations, or a panelist. We're seeing how this the feedback is for this. We may keep panelists because it seems to be kind of more fun and interactive that way. Ricky, if you can go to the next slide. And Laura McKenzie, do we have your line open?
We can open it.
Can we open Laura's line, please?
Yeah. And if you want to go, you should be able to unmute, Laura.
I think I am unmuted. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we
Yes,
can.
we can.
You could, I don't know if you have to enable video on my end, but I can do video if you like.
I don't see that as an option, sorry.
No, no worries.
Actually, let me try something. You might be able to do video now.
Okay, let's see. If now, we don't have to worry about it. Just a second.
There we are.
Oh my
Woohoo!
Now to figure out how to maximize my screen, but we'll figure this out. Just a second. There we go. Perfect. Well, I want to thank everyone for attending this session today. I think we're all sort of continuing to get used to virtual meetings. I think in some respects, a lot of us are actually doing more meetings, myself included, because we're able to, sort of fit those into the day versus having to drive and sort of, worry about sort of the commuting, so to speak. But I wanted to thank everyone for attending today, and also we're pleased, from a Proofpoint perspective, to continue to support ISSA. It's super important, cybersecurity, just in general, very passionate about it. And Proofpoint, from a company perspective, we actually just had our 18-year birthday, which is awesome. And we've been focused, since day one on people-centric security. So we had a discussion earlier about COVID and making sure people are safe. Well, our company, we make sure people are safe from cybersecurity attacks. So kind of very, very fitting. And from a perspective of just, a high level, we look at people-centric security across many different areas. We started out sort of supporting security related to email, because 93% of attacks actually originate over email and require end users to actually click on something, whether it's a link or an attachment. That's not changing at all. And the attackers, they're not going to sleep at all and taking a break with COVID. They're actually stepping up their game. So we continue to kind of step up our game and continue to, come up with new capabilities to continue to support organizations and their people. So whether it's email, whether it's endpoint DLP, whether it's cloud-based security, digital risks, so social media, everyone puts lots of information out there. We continue to help organizations protect people. So I want to, again, thank you for letting us have a couple minutes here to talk a little bit about Proofpoint. And obviously, if you're interested in learning more, we're happy to assist. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura, for being a sponsor for us. Ricky, if you go to the next slide. The other sponsor that we have is Exabeam, and we do appreciate their help also. Just wanted to go over a couple of upcoming events also. So one of the big ones is the Phoenix Security Audit Conference that, like everything else, is going to be virtual this year. yes, we can talk about that. Sorry, I skipped ahead. So this is co-sponsored by ISSA, ISACA, and IIA, and it is one of those really good bang for the buck. It's even going to be cheaper this year. There was too much to explain about the pricing, but as a non-member, it's going to be no more than $65 for 8 hours of training. So definitely go there, and you can get up to 8 CPEs for that. Again, those are going to be half days from 12 to 4 on September 17th or October 1st. You can decide to do both days or only one day. That is totally up to you. Ricky, if you go back up to our slide, sorry. So these are the virtual meetings that we have tentatively scheduled for the remainder of the year to make up for the 2 meetings that we missed as part of the COVID. So look for these coming up September 25th, October 15th, and November 6th. We're going to trade off between the truly noon hour for us and a little bit more in the afternoon on Thursdays and Fridays, just to see if we can get a few more people interested. And we'll definitely have different topics for all this, and again, CPE credits for that. And the other one that I knew about is the interface. Interface is going to continue. It's going to be a little bit more of a smaller time frame than normally, but that is free. It's up to 6 CPE credits, and of course, if you're interested in that, you can go online and look for that. And I think that was all that I had for slides, correct? We'll try and also get out these and any new members within the next week. So, Ricky, take it away.
Sounds good. Thank you, Lorna. Let me stop sharing that. So we'll go back to the panel. And so to pick up where we left off, we're talking about the collection of data, all those different data points, how people are using it. Where do we want to go from there? I know we were talking about potential facial recognition and thermal imaging and the different systems that are being used to capture it. So how do we want to pivot from that talking point?
Well,
I've got like a list of questions here that sort of we think about when we're talking about utilizing these new technologies and collecting any new information. It might be helpful to just sort of frame this around these types of questions so that we can sort of better issue spot as we get into more things. So this is just in regards to temperature, but when I wrote it down, but I think it can apply to just about everything else. So you got a variety of things. So number one, who is collecting it? Is it an automated system? Is it a person? Is it a group of people? Is it a team? What's their training? What's their acknowledgement of both privacy and security practices and procedures? Is this a trusted group? That's the first question. Next is what is being collected, right? So I talked about the different types of things that you can collect in the temperature space. It's not just a number necessarily. You might have more context around it. In the case of thermal imaging, it might be a complete image of somebody's body and where heat is coming off of their body. So what is it that you're collecting? The next is how is it being collected? We've talked about the different kinds of technologies that are being used, but do you have a person that's doing it? Is it an automated solution? Are you using like a mobile app? Are you using some other third-party processes or procedures or something like that? What's the decision process? This is a key sort of question that I think is often overlooked, and I've touched on it several times. And this is sort of, in determining how long you should keep the data, why do you have it to begin with? And then once you, and figuring out where is that decision point that you may not need it anymore. And I'll go into this a little bit more. So one thing that I hear a lot from clients is, well, we need to keep that data for contact tracing purposes, right? So that we can know who was where. And if somebody turns up as positive, we want to be able to go back through the record and figure all that out, who was on site and those kind of things, and what their temperature reading, just in the temperature context, what their temperature readings were, so that we can determine that. Well, do you really need to have their temperature information to know who was on site? So you probably don't. You've got other mechanisms in place, right, to figure out who's on site. If you've got a badging system, that probably gives you the same information that you're looking for. You don't need the temperature record to figure it out. You may have that information from some other source that you already have. But even if you don't have another source, do you need their actual temperature? No, you don't. You could just have a record of them having passed. Or if you knew that they were on site, you may not even need that record. You may only need a record. You may only need to keep a record of people that have failed and you've granted an exception, because by default, if they were on site, they passed. You know that. You don't need a record that they passed. You just know that according to your policy, if they're on site and you don't have a record that they failed, then they must have passed, right? And so that's reducing the amount of data that you're collecting. So anyway, I just want to sort of put that out. And that goes into the next question of what is it that you're storing? So what data is it that you're storing? Are you storing the temperature? Are you storing more context, less context, all of that? And then the last piece, the last question is, what is shared? What third parties are you involving in this process? Are you using third parties to process this data? Are you transmitting it between entities? Are you utilizing third-party apps? Who knows? But these are all the basic questions that you need to think about when you're conducting or thinking about implementing these different contact tracing and screening procedures. And everybody's muted, so I'll just keep
Yeah,
talking.
there I go, talking on mute again. No, I mean, Cody, I think that's spot on, right? Like what we're collecting is one key part, you know, the what, where, when, why, how makes a big difference. And then, I mean, Ricky, you were looking for segues of different directions this conversation could branch. Another one is we have a lot more rich data that we weren't collecting 6 to 12 months ago. And that's only going to increase, to Cody's point, the longer this goes on. This is obviously a very attractive target to attackers. So, I mean, I think another place we can evolve this conversation is, all right, now we have all this extra data. What are we doing to protect it? What are people doing to exploit it? And is there an increased attraction to either ransoming organizations or this data when we're weak and we need it more? You know, is there a kick us while we're down factor? And if so, are we down? Are we more vulnerable with remote workforce, with the way the world has changed? And I think we could talk a little bit about that. So with that, I can maybe kick it over to you or Mark.
Yeah, so I mean, just from an observation standpoint, I mean, we've seen an uptick in ransomware situations that, you know, we've had to assist with. And, you know, the ransomware attacks were not solely focused on, you know, temperature data, right? But they were after an organization for a reason. And when you think about the increased data points that we're collecting, the devices that we're supporting that may not be vetted yet and may not be signed off on or validated from a vulnerability or a connection standpoint, right? So you think about these additional devices that are very singularly focused, but how do they connect and where does the data come in from them? How does the authentication processes work, et cetera? But, you know, ultimately, if an organization is going to be attacked, they're going to be looking through, you know, what's the weakest link that I can get into an organization through. And a lot of these devices that have been connected and or collecting data and are part of the ecosystem and the network, right, really need to be vetted from a vendor standpoint, a supplier perspective, device testing, you know, authentication, logging, et cetera, perspective. And then you have to look at, you know, if an organization is attacked and taken down from a availability perspective, you know, all that data that they did have, right, is either lost or inaccessible, right? And so what do you do from a go forward standpoint? So there's a lot of elements in there, from just updating your risk profiles, updating your attack scenarios, updating the inventory of devices that are being supported, as well as, you know, the data that's being collected, and working your way back upstream of, you know, do we really require this data point to be collected? If it is collected, then for how long? If it does need to be retained, then it needs to be part of our, you know, data retention, you know, policies and procedures, and supporting processes from a technology standpoint. So yeah, they're all
Which circles all the way back to that very beginning point at the beginning of the talk, right? Of what is personal information, and if it's defined as personal information, this kind of data that we're collecting, and it's compromised, then you've got a security breach.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you have all the notification requirements, right? And, you know, whether it's an individual notification, or, you know, the Federal Trade Commission, or, or a, you know, banking regulatory governance body, or somebody else, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And we, you know, you touched on ransomware a little bit. We also have a convergence of a few different disturbing trends, right? Like 2018, 2019, we really saw this rise of enterprise ransomware and more advanced threat actors, you know, from Ryuk on to NetWalker and all these different, you know, threat groups that are really have their act together. They're very organized, they're synchronized. And you know, this home workspace concept, this wasn't like a 3 to 5 year thing that was planned out and evolved. This was, hey, you have 2 weeks, get it done. This needs to happen tomorrow. People can't go into the office. So, I mean, we were blessed to already have a remote workforce to build on, and we had some pretty good foundations. But as I've talked to some of my peers, some of our peers were in impossible situations that they had to get creative and work through. Yeah, and I think, like, as we think through this cycle, starting with, you know, the home workspace, what's their home Wi-Fi like? What's their home environment? Are their kids walking up and playing games on their work system when they walk in to sit down at dinner? You know, what are all these different dynamics? You know, illegal downloads or out of policy downloads or download attempts, you know, are going up. High risk browsing activity. You know, if I left the cubicle, drove home, get home, there's a really good chance my high risk evening activities are not going to be on a company asset. But if I'm just sitting at my desk and the sun sets and I eat dinner at my desk and now it's time to watch YouTube videos and home lab and experiment, do I necessarily power down one system and switch to another? Or, you know, so I feel like we get into these topics. Are you guys seeing that these types of home user specific risks as well?
I'll tell you one thing that I've seen a lot of recently, and I do a lot of data breach work, is companies that had you know, laptops or desktop computers that employees were using in the office, and they were configured to be on the you know, enterprise network, you know, relying on enterprise protections like firewalls and that kind of stuff. And now you've taken it out of that environment and you've put it on somebody's home network. So all those ports, for example, that it didn't matter if they were open because you were inside of a, you know, an enterprise network. Now they're just exposed to the internet. So the amount of RDP breaches that I've been dealing with is just skyrocketed because people are just, you know, port scanning and finding RDP just wide open, taking over people's computers. It's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. What we've seen is just not only an expansion of, you know, the rapid deployment of network access, right, and remote networking capabilities. That's just the beginning. But what we've seen is organizations revamping their entire endpoint protection, endpoint monitoring, endpoint response strategy of, you know, the agents that we had running in the office environment are not adequate in an untrusted environment. So we need to upgrade or refresh or get new capabilities from an endpoint investigation, endpoint memory file capture perspective, maybe an endpoint isolation standpoint. So there's all these scenarios that you run into in an untrusted home environment that you know, to Cody's point, you don't have, all right, in as much of a perimeter as we have left in the enterprise environment. So really a lot of focus on endpoint solutions, endpoint risk management, trying to prevent you know, malicious software from even being executed on the machine in the first place, and then having more of a defensive posture of protecting that device from a file memory and download perspective.
And then let's add one more flavor to this, and that's now that you've got a device sitting in your bedroom, which was usually locked in your office, you're probably going to be using it for personal use more frequently, and so you've got personal data that's now rapidly accelerating in the amount of that's being stored on company equipment. Regardless of what your policy is, your employees are probably doing it. And so what's the plan to protect that personal information? I mean, you may have a policy that says you're not allowed to do it, but what if you don't? And we're seeing that too, where companies may not have had those policies in place ahead of time. And yeah, there was a social norm in the office. I'm not going to go on Facebook. I'm not going to, store pictures of my trip or whatever on this computer because it's a work computer. But, after it's been sitting at your house for 6+ months, you're starting to think of these things as your own now. And so there's a lot more of that going on too.
Yeah, definitely. And Laura posted some great points in the panelist chat that I'll echo for everybody else. But, there's definitely like zero trust that was sort of like a futuristic or, hey, we need that for our salespeople in the field kind of thing last year. Now it's okay. All of a sudden, as you guys both brought up, bringing those network protections to the endpoint host, everything like from malware URL filtering, C2 communication, all that kind of stuff. In addition to the agents and things we already had to have there, or whatever strategy that was. And it's, we talked about that this pandemic could go on a while, but the paradigm shift is permanent. A whole lot of people aren't ever going to need to go back to the office. We can't look at this like we're duct taping and bail wiring things. We've got to look at this like, how do we take this zero trust model of theory from a few years back and make it practice and reality? Because even if, God willing, hopefully the pandemic's over in 6 to 9 months, at least for the United States, but our remote workforce challenges aren't going to go away. They're going to be here 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
Yeah, I think that's it. Sorry. I was going to say, I think that's a great point that Mike brings up about the remote workforce, because given the transition now, and you see a lot more in the news of lots more organizations are moving to, you don't have to come back to the office ever. I know Salesforce, Facebook, some of the really big players have transitioned away from that office requirement, and the work from home is probably going to be way more prevalent in the future and less stringent about, coming into an office location, as, this has kind of been the litmus test of validating that people can actually work from home in large scales.
Yeah. Yeah, and just a quick comment on zero trust. So if you've not had an opportunity to look at zero trust, I would definitely take some time to evaluate, how your organization is either analyzing what zero trust is or evaluating your technology stack against zero trust capabilities, because it's going to transform your ability to allow basically a trusted identity to access a set of data with any device across any level of network or transport that you allow. And so you really abstract a lot of the traditional layers of devices and networking and controls, and you're really focusing on the identity and the data that they're accessing. And is that allowed given, who they are, where they're coming from, what are they getting to, and what's the permissions say about it from, a trusted identity perspective. So that's going to really help support the remote workforce in general, but also allow very granular capabilities of access given particular use cases and permissions without all of the traditional networking gaps of the technologies that we had in the past. Of if you were in the environment, then you had access to almost everything. So definitely take some time with zero trust, because it's data oriented and it's identity oriented across devices and environments.
I think one of the things that we found at in our financial institution is that there's also a lot of people who had never been allowed to work from home for whatever reason. Either they were regulated users, especially there's a whole branch that we never let them work from home prior to this point, and it was never even a possibility to do so. But with that also comes that just some of the really basic stuff as far as security awareness. Do not be sharing your passwords. Don't be writing it and putting it underneath your keyboard for your teenage son to find. Don't click on those phishing, spamming emails, because what we've found is that there's a lot more of those types of activities that are happening now for a segment of our population that had never worked remotely before, and now they're prime targets for all of that cyber warfare activity happening. So that's something that we've also found a lot. Is sometimes it's like we have to go back to basics and say, yeah, don't share your passwords. I mean, simple things like that, on top of all these other complicated ideas of capacities and remote working and VPNs and endpoint protection and web-based blocking of inappropriate sites.
Well, yeah, that's a great point, and that's something that we've seen as well is a huge, because as Mike and Cody mentioned, with the transition, now you have somebody who's at home it's a completely totally different attack vector. Like before, when you were in an office, you'd have to jump through several layers, reception or whatever, to get to a physical person and talk to them, where now they're probably online, they're probably on LinkedIn or some other social media, and they're probably got a cell phone that they're using for work, that you could easily get that information and start spamming them and phish them. And I know we've seen instances where people have been targeted just because they're working from home now, so they're an easier target to get to, especially some of the higher level executives and stuff. So
I think this is a good time to put on the privacy hat again. And when we're talking about working at home, implementing security outside of the office, a lot of the security tools that we're probably discussing are behavioral monitoring sorts of things. Well, employment law now, let's bring that in as well. You're now monitoring employee behavior outside of a working environment, potentially outside of working hours. There's a whole slew of new privacy issues that come in on that, and you can get yourselves in lots of trouble. Like if you leave a camera on, for example, on a laptop, or if you've got proximity monitoring that's happening outside of a work environment, and somebody's personal life, whatever they're doing, maybe they're around somebody that they don't want anybody to know that they're around, but these proximity detectors are going off and you're collecting that data. All of those kinds of things now come into play, and is more than just a bare privacy issue. Now you've got employment law issues as well, and this is a really big deal in Europe, but over here in the United States too, it's something else to think about.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's really a whole interesting, unique set of conundrums that we never had time to think through. I mean, one thing I'll say about zero trust, if you're new to it, at the very beginning, it can be an intimidating topic. And I agree with Mark, definitely dive in and fully understand it. But you can start with some simple basics to zero trust that will get you going. Adding additional factors of authentication to the things you care most about protecting. So even across SaaS applications, you can ask yourself, what's the worst case scenario if this app gets owned? And across, if you have 100 SaaS applications, 90 of them, you'll be like, it's not good. But then there will be like 5 or 10 where you'll be like, whoa, that would be catastrophic. We don't want that owned. Those are the ones to zero in on and start your zero trust, start your conditional access rules, your branching logic there. And again, on the IR side, you can get super advanced with incident response and SOC monitoring based upon zero trust. But there's some simple things and simple behaviors that 80-20 rule will get you started on a whole lot of the bad stuff without having to get into the infinite complexity right away. For example, speed limit violations, a very big one. You know, somebody cannot get from New York to Hong Kong in 45 minutes. So if you see that, you know, you can set alerting on some very basic things like speed limit violations or multiple location access. That will get 80-20 rule. They'll pick up a whole lot of stuff. Now, is it possible somebody is accessing a service from a phone running NordVPN or Tor at the same time they're legitimately accessing the same service from their desktop in their living room? Yeah, you'll have some false positives, but you can zero in, minimal pun intended, on a whole lot of bad stuff with a very high fidelity and not a whole lot of false positives by looking at these simple zero trust scenarios versus the super complex ones.
I think that's a great point, Mike. And kind of following up on what Cody mentioned earlier about the, you know, employment law. I know that's one of the things that, you know, we've been wondering, given, you know, the transition to work from home, is a lot of companies typically would have a work from home policy. And that's always, you know, a question area or a gray area right now, because, you know, what is the work from home policy when there is no option to go to the office, right? And where do you draw those lines, and what, you know, could be seen as work expense versus home expense for having a home office? And I think, you know, that's something that a lot of people that I've been talking to have brought up, because some organizations haven't even approached it yet. They're still with the, you know, this is a COVID situation, stay tuned, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I remember managing large teams in the past, and if you wanted to get remote access and work from home permissions, you had to basically justify it, and HR would give you a separate policy to provide to that person. They would sign a remote authorization form from a working perspective, and then you would file it with HR. Right, that's long gone. So the companies that have not refactored their entire you know, remote working policies and taking those into account is, you know, they're behind the times and need to catch up on, you know, what does the new paradigm look like? Because to everybody's point, you know, companies are not going back 100% into an office regardless. Most companies will go back a certain percentage of their staff, but a lot of companies are trying to, you know, convert to fully remote working, and it's that trend's only going to continue.
Well, and I think to that point, one of the things that, you know, being, you know, putting my security hat on for a second, work from home is going to be very different, you know, if you look at it with a security lens, right? You're probably going to want to have an area that's secure, you can lock on the door, those kind of things. And sometimes those are called out in policies. I've had those in previous jobs, where, yeah, you need to have, you know, a locked door that when you're not in there, you know, whatever it might be, a filing cabinet where you store your laptop or something to that effect. And right now, with everything going on, like, you know, like everybody's been saying, sometimes you might be working from your bedroom, right? And you got your laptop, your work laptop in your bedroom, which is probably not the most secure place in the house. But, you know, those are some of the things that I think we as organizations need to kind of revisit and be aware of and be conscious of from a security perspective, that, you know, these devices now are probably going to be exposed in locations that probably they weren't intended to be in, right?
Yeah, I think the traditional sales team management practices, right, of the road warriors and the sales teams, right, everybody has that now. So, you know, going to a Starbucks may or may not be as, you know, dangerous as just walking into your living room and being on your home network if you haven't put any additional controls or monitoring on your home network. So yeah, it's definitely that, you know, that paradigm is here. We need to manage it. And that it just goes back to the, the identity of the person, the device they're using, the hygiene of that device, the data that they're trying to access, and then, making sure that the access is provided under the right conditions. And then there's logging and auditing that needs to occur of who accessed what over what time frame. To go back to Mike's point of kind of the behavioral side of it as well, of what's the typical new behavior look like from a remote workforce. They're still getting access to files, they're still getting access to data, they're still accessing SaaS applications or internal apps on a periodic basis, and they have a certain pattern of workforce activity based on their team, their function, and their role. And that's something that still has to get analyzed and looked at from a anomaly standpoint.
Definitely. Yeah, and I know, we've talked about, and Laura put in the chat as well, there's an increase in targeting and attacking people. So we're seeing that. And in these home environments, a fun experiment that we just did on the security team and within IT is, I was just testing around and playing with some stuff and Nmap scanning some of my home networks and seeing like, oh, one of the kids has this. Oh, I didn't know they had that device connected. And, that kind of thing. So we ran that experiment across our security team, just challenged everybody, like, go home, Nmap scan your network, and then when you go over to your parents' house, get their permission, do the same thing. And there were we found like there's a lot of risks out there, a lot of things that you're like, well, we wouldn't allow this on our corporate network, but here it is an adjacent peer. And then back to the point Cody brought up, like, what ports do you natively have open in the default configuration of that device? What needs to be informed about host hardening guidelines with this different way of working? And then with the document security, there really does, like, as we go into zero trust, I know there's been a lot of talk about and solutions to take them at even to a document level. Things like automated data classification, document tagging, policy-based sharing. There should probably be policies that dynamically can detect the difference between if I just exported the customer database from a CRM application versus if I'm printing out a copy of my resume, right? They're very different, and the technology does now exist to classify those things and allow for different activities. But again, these are things that most organizations were evolving towards, and now it's just sort of all dropped on everybody.
Well, that's kind of a good question too, is because I know that some of us had policies already kind of in place for remote workers. And I have the feeling that because a lot of this is kind of like, we don't know how long this is going to go on. We thought it may be just a month or two. It might be, now it could be a couple of years. How fast and how important is it for all of these organizations to update their policies and procedures, especially if they add additional tools that were not available and maybe their employees didn't know about prior to this?
I mean, on one hand, go ahead, Cody. Looks like you're about to.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think all the policies and procedures in general are going to need to be updated. And the other thing that I'll mention, and this is another thing that comes up in Europe, and I don't know how many of you deal with European issues that frequently, but you also may have to actually enumerate what tools that you're using to inform your employees, and what data is being collected, what kind of things that you're tracking. Especially when it comes to like behavioral tracking and those sorts of things, there's different requirements depending on what you're doing and that sort of thing. And so as you have moved from an office environment to a home environment, you've got those issues. And then we've got California, where you've got to provide notice to your employees of what data you're collecting on them, and what you're doing with it. That's required now under the CCPA. There's the rest of the CCPA issues that are have thankfully been extended for at least a year as of a couple of days ago. I don't remember the exact date off the top of my head, but I know it was extended. But the CCPA regulations right now will not, fully impact employee data, but you do still have to provide notice. And so that's something that, it should be updated if you've got residents in California. And then, as with everything else, I mean, we've talked about all the screening things. All of those are going to need policies in place, written procedures for what you're doing, that sort of thing. And it's going to be a lift. But as everybody else has mentioned, we're probably in this for the long haul. So it makes sense to stop relying on old policies, and let's go ahead and update what we've got in place and to accommodate the foreseeable future.
One thing I do like to point out to employees periodically too, when they ask something like, hey, because occasionally you get somebody will call in like, hey, I didn't know you monitor my activities. I do like to point them back to the splash screen that everybody clicks OK on anytime they authenticate to any domain joined system for any mature organization in the world that basically says, we monitor everything. This is not your device. You have no entitlement here. And if you object to that, don't continue. I mean, so we do have that disclosure. And to me, that's pretty clear cut. And I've even put screenshots of that to people. Hey, did you know that when you signed in, you clicked this? Oh. Yeah, and that usually ends the conversation right there, because that, like, we addressed that years ago in our industry. It's not, this monitoring thing isn't new. And as we went from signature-based AV to NJAV to NGAV plus EDR and all these different things, and we started breaking SSL. I mean, there's a more than a decade of precedent here of this stuff happening without having to redisclose everything. And I don't think we should give the attackers the advantage of disclosing every tool we have. I think we should just say categorically, yes, if you're on this system, you are not private. If you want private, go to that system. Or don't connect.
Yeah, I agree that, historically that's been the case, but, with current developments with privacy law, again, especially in Europe, and I just went through this process. I agree with you from a security standpoint. We don't want to have to spell out the specific tools. That was guidance that we had received from some European regulators, though, is they wanted all of the explicit tools disclosed to employees that were being used to monitor their behavior. From a security standpoint, I completely agree. You don't want to do that because you're giving up, too much information. So we got it whittled down to describing the function of the tools, but there was still a requirement that that disclosure was at least in place, because workers' rights, workers' privacy is extremely big in Europe, especially in Germany, which I'll just say, if anybody has any dealings with Germany, you probably know what I'm talking about.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, no, you're right. Like the European, I'm glad you got that whittled down for the sake of whatever company that was, because that's just too far. Like there's got to be a balance.
Yeah, we didn't want to have to do really anything except for the bare, like, here's the kind of stuff we collect. But we had to go further and say why and what was happening and what processes we were performing on it. But at least we didn't have to get farther than that, which would have been bad. But
yeah.
Radio silence. All right.
So this is probably a good segue point. What questions do we have, among the audience and attendees here today? I know there have been some flowing in, but we've got a pretty diverse crowd here, both from a legal and risk as well as a cyber and security perspective. What's on your collective minds besides the long weekend coming up?
Yeah, and if you want to, at the top of your screen, there should be a Q&A icon that you can click on, and that will bring you up so that you can ask a question. And or, Ricky, do we want to open lines? Or is everybody, yeah, just really ready for the weekend?
We can open up lines if anybody has a question they want to, you know, verbally ask. We can definitely do that.
I've got a minor topic if anybody wants to hit it, and that's how you can screw with these screening and scanning technologies. You know, this is something that you know, you might want to think about pen testing. So if you've got thermal imaging and temperature screening, you know, people with sunburns, people that have just been sitting in front of air conditioners, people that hold ice packs to their heads, you know, there's all kinds of ways to defeat these and gain access. So if you've got an automated solution and you're trying to prevent access by that, you got to know that some people are actually going to attempt to defeat this. And so you need to be aware of these sorts of things. They can also be overwhelmed. So we did a bunch of tests with thermal imaging where we heated up like an iron and held it next to somebody's head. And so on the thermal scan, it looked kind of like this, you know, where, you know, it overloaded the sensor and caused errors. And so, you know, there's that kind of stuff. And then with the proximity sensors that we talked about, there's a lot of false positives too that you have to be aware of, because those can be set off through walls, people, you know, passing each other in the bathroom, you know, people walking down the hall. Like if your wall behind your desk is right adjacent to a hallway, as people are walking down the hallway, you could be separated by a wall, but it's going to be triggered all the time too. So anyway, just throw those kind of things out there. Don't just adopt whatever these technologies are without, you know, running through some of your standard testing, and think about ways that people might try to defeat them too.
So, I mean, I know that when we had the retinal scans originally came out, there was also, especially when you were talking about the infrared scans, that made me think about that, you know, they could tell, you know, if it changed significantly because of, for example, pregnancy or illness, or you know, macular degeneration as time goes on. Are there things, to your knowledge, that those infrared cameras are capturing that are maybe delving into that health arena of things that you wouldn't want to necessarily, that change over the time, or can indicate other things that probably employers don't want to get into?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know all the things that you could read from a body thermal imaging scan. But I would imagine that you know, if somebody has some other sort of condition, I don't know, perhaps diabetes would be an example, because I think your blood circulation might be you know, impacted by that disease, and so there might be parts of your body that are abnormally cold. That may be something, you know, if you're doing a full body thermal scan, that you might be able to tell that you wouldn't have already known, that you wouldn't know about that person but for this information. And so, yeah, there's those kinds of things. I think that certainly would be the case. You may be able to detect if somebody's pregnant based on a thermal scan, if you're getting more than just their face, which, by the way, you know, this is what the point is that where these imaging cameras are set up, many times they're getting full body images. And it's not just of somebody's face. And so that's an important aspect to think about. I don't know. I'm sure that there's other things that you could figure out about a person based on, you know, body temperature variations in different parts of their body. I don't know what they are, but you're right. That is information that you're not intending to collect. And now that you've collected it, you better watch out.
Right. Well, and if we're talking about just external temperature, I would think too, you'd have to deal with the weather in that particular area. I mean, you in Minnesota in the winter, if you're outside and it's 40 below and then you come in, your temperatures, you could probably hide a, you know, a temperature on, or in our case, if we've been outside for too long and then come in, we might actually register too high. And it could be more of heat exhaustion, heat stroke, something else, rather than I've got a fever. It's just my body temperature is too high because I was doing probably unsafe things outside when it's 120.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, yeah, and kind of, Lorna, to your point as well, like Cody being in Minnesota, if you're wearing a parka in -40, you might be sweating underneath that parka when you walk inside somewhere, right? So yeah. I'm just saying, lived in the snow before, so. But yeah, you know that there's things that could throw off those temperature sensors or infrared or whatever it might be. So yeah, there's definitely, you know, additional data points, for lack of a better term, that may skew things, right?
And if you've got an automated system, this is another thing, you know, make sure that it's fail safe, not fail open, which, you know, that it seems basic, but I've seen it more than once where, you know, if it's not going to prevent somebody from getting in, if it doesn't work, it only will prevent them if it detects that something is wrong. And so when you're throwing, you know, using techniques to throw off the sensor, it will fail open. So, you know, seems obvious, but I think it's worth mentioning because I've seen it happen.
Yeah, excellent point.
I think we're got a few minutes left. Any other quick nuggets that anybody wants to share on the topic before we wrap up for today?
Yeah, from my standpoint, I'd recommend that everybody, you know, take a look at their updated policies and procedures around not just, you know, confidentiality or acceptable use or the employee agreement, right, that you typically signed when you joined an organization, but, you know, where are the refreshed versions of those given the current climate? And if you can't find them, ask for them and read them, you know, and see what they say. And get familiar with them. So, you know, definitely take a look at the refreshed policies of working from anywhere, and also, you know, take a look at not only the devices that are being used in the environment, but, you know, ask questions about, well, where did they come from, and does the vendor have any, you know, security vetting that's been done on them? You know, how are they connected into the environment? You know, where do the logs go? Where does the data flow? You know, there's a lot of just informational questions that you could ask to find out more about what's going on based on your role, whether it's, you know, security, risk, compliance, or, you know, even facilities. So yeah, ask questions, find out more. If there's areas that you think need to be improved, bring up the topics and help improve them. And whether it's a policy, procedure, a device test, maybe questioning why certain data is being kept or how it's being used, and improving the data retention side and the data security side, I definitely encourage everybody to get engaged, ask questions, find out more, and see how you can improve your own environment.
Yeah,
Awesome.
definitely well said.
Great information.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the last thing I'd add from a remote workforce security perspective is just look at, one, the protections you relied upon before. Two, how an attacker, like what your threat actor's objectives are when they come after you. And three, how that dynamic has changed since with all of the things that have changed, whether it's the home environment, the ways that people are using the technology or behaving, and just what risk that opens up and which ones you're comfortable with versus which ones you need to mitigate. And I feel like that would go a long way to at least bringing everybody up to zero where they were in March, if not hopefully ahead.
I guess I'll add, you know, screening practices and requirements are variable within every state. So you need to look at your state, at minimum, your state's health department guidelines or requirements that have been issued. They are different, and usually they're industry specific. So, you know, we mentioned gyms and retail stores and restaurants, but there's also manufacturing and professional services. So depending on whatever your industry in, your state may have issued different requirements for what kind of screening you need to conduct in order to open up your business. And so you need to make sure that you're looking at whatever those are. And I will point out that in New York, for example, they explicitly state that you're not allowed to maintain temperature temperature records. Temperature data on individuals is not something that you're allowed to store. You can store whether or not somebody passed, failed, or whether or not they were cleared or not cleared, but you can't record what their actual temperature was. So, there's stuff like that that you just need to make sure that you're aware of and making sure that you're compliant with.
Great. Well, I think that pretty much brings us to the end of today's session. Lorna, anything else you want to add?
No, we really appreciate all the panelists, and we especially appreciate that they were very flexible, since this was our maiden voyage into virtual meetings. So we did learn a lot this week, and we appreciate everybody's patience for that. Hopefully that means it'll be a little bit easier for all of us next time. So things to look forward to. Just remember that CPEs are from a survey that's going to be going out. It will be short, I promise. And that to look forward to a new virtual meeting for us. It'll be on a Friday, going 11 to 1, I think in about 3 weeks. That's going to be our next one. And we're probably going to, get some feedback too, and saying, do people like panelists versus presentations versus a combination of both. But we really appreciate all your participation, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, just echo Lorna's sentiment. Thanks to everybody for attending. Thanks to the panelists. It's been a great discussion, and really appreciate you guys making the time to make this work.
Yeah, thanks.
Sure.
All right, and that concludes our meeting. So we'll see you next time, guys. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks.